All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Phillip Roberts, Extension Entomologist located here in Tipton. We also have Dr. Jason Schmidt. And Dr. Schmidt's been with us now for maybe 6, 7 years, 8 years?
7, 8.
I tell you what, time flies when you get ready. Isn't that right, Wayne Brown?
Absolutely, yeah.
But we're going to go ahead and get started because we're a few minutes late already. So Dr. Schmidt's going to talk to us about beneficial insects, and he's got some real good information, and I think it'll make us think a little bit as we move forward with our insect management this year and in the future.
Well, good morning. I'm going to talk, my focus today will be on beneficials and conservation in cotton. And where I want to put this in is a word that is now becoming more and more a part of the fabric of our lives, and that is sustainability and what that really means. And while it looks like it can be really, really complicated, it actually boils down to 3 main components in any business model. One is we're always going to have people involved, and people are going to demand certain products. People are going to demand certain quality of those products. We depend on the environment to be able to produce our crops, to be able to move our crops around and whatnot. And so those environmental services are key, and that's my area in the insect world. And the last one is whatever we do to try to promote sustainability, there must be profits involved. Otherwise, it is not sustainable. So this always has to be a piece of it. Even Walmart is now changing their language to trying to find ways to promote sustainable types of cotton that do these end goals. And I don't know if you've read some of the things or if you've been collaborating with Walmart on some of their research. I spoke with some folks in the soil health group who've been doing some things with them and promoting soil health and areas there. And the area that I work in the environment that relates to this sustainability package is biodiversity. And I'm going to share a little bit about the biodiversity in cotton that we've been observing over the last little while, and specifically on predators, and then predators feeding on different pests. And one of the reasons why biodiversity is important in cotton and other crops is because of this. Now this looks really crazy, and it might look kind of scary, but what this is I've pulled some images of insect mouth parts from different insect groups that we might find out there. And when these are very small, when they're posted this big, they look scary to me. But on this right here, this is a panel here of 6 different species of Carabid beetles that feed on the ground and eat on different things. If you look, their mouth parts are heavily armed. These things definitely chomp and can handle larger types of food to eat. And if you look over here, this one this is an annoying one, the mosquitoes, and we know of other flies that also bother us, hang out around our eyes and feed on us. But all these different mouth parts and having diversity of those mouth parts means that they can feed on many different pests in our fields. So biodiversity from that standpoint and promoting it is quite important. Global Review around the world has put together a number of things. They take data from all kinds of systems, different production systems, including cotton, from areas in Africa, South America, in the US, Australia, and they ask questions about, does biodiversity really matter for our crops? And we put all that data together from what we have right now. When we have more species of something I've talked about before, and I know Phillip talks about it too, more species of natural enemies, those that feed on pests, tend to correlate with better pest control. So if we promote those, we get more pest control out of those species. The other one that's important in those pollination crops is when we have more species of pollinators, we tend to have greater pollination of our crops. So that suggests that having biodiversity there and finding ways to maintain it when we can, that also works with our sustainability package, should be good. And so I want to share a few things. I think that in Georgia, we're actually set up really nicely to show that sustainability in cotton and our other systems just because of how our land is situated and the biodiversity that we have out there. It's pretty awesome. And I find, and you've seen, and some of you send me pictures of different insects and things that you see in cotton, and I've also collected a bunch of them, and there are a diversity of different natural enemies out there feeding, which I think is exciting. It's why I get up every day to go study them. So I'm going to share just a few examples, and then I'm going to hand it over to Phillip. But one study that we did for a number of years is looking at what cover crops mean for growing predators and natural enemies in your system. And then the second one, I'm going to talk a little bit just generally about conservation and in Georgia, our opportunities. And I'm just going to close there, and Phillip will take over. So we went out, because you've probably heard in some counties we have whiteflies that are crazy. I mean, they get at really crazy levels, and it's definitely a problem. And there's a number of us working on them. Well, the area that I'm working on is, we took a little tour, a little field tour around Georgia in these main counties where you see cotton and peanut and vegetables produced. And we went out there and we collected predators from cotton fields and then asked the very basic question, are they feeding on whiteflies? And if they are, which ones of those predators are feeding on whiteflies? Okay? And as some of you will notice, I don't have every possible predator, but I have the common ones that we would catch in sweep nets. Okay? And how I ask that question is, I take those predators, I grind them up, and I make them into a little predator soup. Okay? I clean that predator soup up, and I get a little clear vial of DNA. I ask questions of that DNA, and the one that I asked this time was, are these predators feeding on whiteflies? And so this looks a little complicated, but it's pretty simple. I took all of the samples that we had and I put them into 3 categories here to assess their biocontrol value. That is, how frequently we tested them positive for whitefly in their gut. Okay? I bin these by piercing sucking, so those that have mouth parts that would stick into the whitefly and just suck out their juices. Chewing ones like coccinellas that chew and eat whiteflies. And then, of course, the one that everybody likes, right, are the spiders. Everybody's favorite, right? No. So the piercing sucking tend to win. Number one, they're pretty abundant out there. So these are like Geocaris, which is Philip's favorite, Aureus, Nabis. These predators are pretty common, and they tested positive the most frequently. It goes down in spiders or less. Then I broke those out. So what I did was, by those different groups, I broke them out and ranked the ones that I collected by the frequency with which they were detected with whitefly DNA. And minute pirate bugs tend to kind of win that one, at least from the predators that I was able to collect. And another one was in spiders, the lynx spider, but not the one that big green one, but the smaller striped one is out there. So I want to share one other thing in that, and I've showed this before, but this is kind of the final production. We took and asked the question about what cover crops then are doing for predation and those groups of predators. I'm going to break this down. I kind of screened it out, and it looks more complicated than it is. But what this is I'm just going to show one box of this and then break it out. But this is, we collected predators in 2017, 2018 from within 3 different cover crop situations. So no cover is that blue, and anywhere you see that blue, it's going to be no cover crops. This is typical tillage. We used a crimson clover cover crop planted in the fall, or a rye cover planted in the fall. We terminated that with herbicides. We planted cotton into it. So this is the early season measurement of the number of predators in each one of those. So the wider that bar, the more predators we found in that cover crop situation with cotton. And rye wins, for sure. We found a lot more predators in there in the early season. Now this is where it gets kind of wild because I'm going to show everything at once. But here's the take-home message. Oh, I have this, I forgot. The take-home message for this is if you just look at these in early season, what we see is a lot more predators in rye, okay? A little bit more in there. When you get to the mid-season where we're squaring, where we have a lot of cotton vegetation in there. There's a lot more cotton vegetation than there is that residue of the cover crop from the prior season. Look at the numbers of predators between those different cover crop situations. They about even out. So there's so much cotton vegetation. We have tons of different predators within those systems in mid-season. And if you look in the late season, it's the same. When we start, I'm calling late season when we start flowering, when we start producing bolls. Okay? So we got a lot of predators during that time. Doesn't matter a cover crop during that time. It does matter in the early season. For having a cover crop, you're going to get more predators in the early season. Okay? How am I doing here? So I can get that. Great. Okay, good. I'm doing good. Okay, so let me say, since I have a little bit more time, usually I get to here and I don't have any time. Let me break a little bit more of this piece down for you. I didn't want to show a lot of data today. We decided we'd just show a few. So this is my main data piece. What this lower bar is here in each one of these, so each one of these here is set up in this area. So these are different prey that we found that those predators had eaten. Okay, and I put these in a few different categories. One of them, this sort of reddish one, these are all the different pest things that they were eating at different times of the year. So you can track that down here. Key ones here will be thrips, ligas, whiteflies, and our southern green stink bug are the ones that I was able to test for. Now there are other ones that occur there. These are pretty common. Okay, so notice there's a low frequency of them actually feeding on those pests, but they are feeding on them. Second, these incidental, this yellow here, if you look at each one of these are kind of incidental pests. And they could be a pest in one area and not in the other, such as spider mites or aphids. And what you can see, especially from that yellow one, which represents these aphids, is that predators are feeding a lot on those aphids. And there's reasons why. These are nice little yummy popcorn sugar tablets. They're yummy. They're helpless because if you see them out there wandering around, they're not running around, and a lot of them don't have any wings. So they're kind of ambling around on there and feeding on the cotton, and the predators come up and just chew on them because they're yummy little sugar packets. So aphids out there at low levels are definitely providing fuel for those different predators. And that's important. They need things to eat to keep them there. So I think Georgia is awesome for the opportunities of maintaining biodiversity in our systems for a few reasons. One of them is just how the state is set up. So if you look, and here's a little map of Georgia where I think this was from the Fish and Wildlife. And what it shows here is all these blue areas are different tributaries of rivers that run throughout the state. And so basically, we're farming within a matrix of these water areas. And it's hard, as you know, and I've seen some areas, you can't farm in a wetland area or a swampy area. Some of our fields run off because of the topology. It gets really wet, difficult to produce there. Other things do grow in those areas, and those are areas that can fuel biodiversity. So what the NRCS has suggested is that when we have our farms nested within there, those are opportunities for building biodiversity. And some of the things they recommend is to keep areas of production somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 feet or so away from those water areas. So like here's a pond. These are awesome. I've been to a few of our cotton retreats where we fish and cruise around. Having some vegetation around there just makes it look beautiful, and those are areas for biodiversity to live and grow. So I think that's an awesome opportunity. Not everywhere where we produce food and fiber can that be said, or is that even an opportunity? And the other opportunity on those edges is this area that some are working on right now, and that is adding something into those areas like different wildflower mixes and things like that that'll grow on the sides of areas, because those are areas where pollinators can feed and move around, and also those are areas where natural enemies can hang out as well. So that's a growing area. The technology is not easy because some of these flowering areas may not work very well. I'm playing with it right now. I have a number of contracts with solar, with different whatever. Sometimes they work out really good, sometimes they don't. So there's some risks involved. But any ways to maintain some of that natural biodiversity will bring biodiversity into the fields. So with that, I'll end. I brought a few more of these. I've sent these out to the county agents around the counties. This is a really quick guide that has some natural enemies in there to view, and also some of the common pests. And with that, I'll turn it over to Phillip.
All right, any other questions for Dr. Schmidt? All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and take a few minutes and just talk about some different topics, but going to come back to what Dr. Schmidt visited with us about, because that's so important that we keep going that direction. I've spoken to several of you before that I show this slide every presentation. And I've been joking with our cotton extension agronomist, Dr. Camp Han, who's been with us for about a year now. Encourage you to meet him. But he says I could do my presentation in 15 seconds and we could call it good. Hire a scout. Use thresholds. If you're above thresholds, take care of the problem. If you're below, let's let Mother Nature do what she can do to help us, Jason. We're done. But I am going to share a little more information with you. But hire a scout. If you're interested in learning about scouting insects on cotton, peanuts, and soybeans, myself and Dr. Mark Abney do a half-a-day training on scouting insects. We do one in Tifton and one in Midville. Tifton is always the first Monday of June. Midville's the second Tuesday in June. So June 6th in Tifton if you'd like to come, June 14th in Midville. Now I want to take the majority of my time and talk to you about tarnished plant bugs, okay? This is a pest that in most years, they're an occasional problem. Each and every year somewhere in Georgia there are fields that need to be treated for tarnished plant bugs. Now we read in the popular press in other parts of the Cotton Belt, the Mid-South, more recently up in North Carolina and parts of Virginia, tarnished plant bug is their number one problem, number one pest. In some of these areas they're spraying 5-6 times for this one insect. So it's a concern of mine that we, in my mind, are seeing an increase in the occurrence of plant bugs across the state of Georgia. Now, I'd like feedback from you if you've got anything, but here's just the adult plant bug, here's the little immature. But again, it's something that seems to be changing over time. Now, one of the things that entomologists like myself do across the cotton belt, for every insect pest, we will estimate the percent of acres that are infested by a particular pest and the percent of acres we treat. And I pulled this data together Monday. I was just curious because I hadn't really, I think there's a trend, but what have I been reporting for the last 10 years? But if you just look at this blue line, we go back 10 years ago, we were only at about 15% infested. But over time, and I kind of thought this was happening, but I wasn't sure, we're up to over 60% of the acres infested. Now I'll tell you, typically our plant bug problem infested acres are more prevalent on the western side of the state. As we go east to East Georgia, we tend to have fewer plant bugs, but they are present. So it's just a trend that's happening. Also, if we look at the percent acres that I estimated we sprayed, and these are estimates, But we're usually less than 10%. We kind of bump up, come down, but in 2021, I had us over 30% of the acres. And that's disturbing because a lot of times when plant bugs are a problem for us in cotton, it's when we begin squaring. And Dr. Schmidt had one very important point I want to re-emphasize. But if you remember, he had the predators in early season in a no cover crop situation, conventional tillage. It was a very low population. But if you recall, he says once we got squaring, everything evened out. So what was happening? How did it even out? A lot of those beneficial predators, beneficial insects, are coming into the field during that window of squaring where plant bugs are concerned. That's a point in time where we don't want to disrupt with insecticide those beneficial insects, okay? Now, if we have a plant bug problem, we've got to take care of it. But if we don't, we need to let all these predators set up shop in our cotton fields. But it's a disturbing trend. It's one that I hope we don't get to, where this is more of a normal for us. But we had some issues last year. I spent a lot of time looking at some fields where we kind of weren't quite on time with what we needed to do to fully protect that cotton. These plant bugs are primarily going to feed on small squares. They have a little needle-like mouth part. I love the slide with all the mouth parts. We have these sucking predators, a needle-like mouth part. They're very closely related to a plant bug. It's got a needle-like mouth part. It's a true bug. But they'll feed on a small square. They inject some enzymes in there that dissolve the tissues so they can suck out that plant material. Now, once that plant recognizes a square has been damaged, the plant will shed it. It's a decision the plant makes. It aborts that position. Once it's gone, it's gone. But it takes, for something to get that brown or even black, that could have been damaged a week ago and it just hadn't fell on the ground. But within a day or two that it's fed on, the abscission process starts, and if you touch that square, it'll just fall off very easily. Plant bugs will also, another thing that we sometimes see from plant bugs is something I refer to as a dirty bloom. So not all plant bugs read the textbook saying they're supposed to feed on small squares. Sometimes they'll feed on a half-grown square or 3/4 grown square. When the plant bug feeds on that square, I like to think like a plant. The plant says, well, I've invested a lot of energy in this square. I'm not going to shed it. So the plant holds that square. And when the bloom opens, where the plant bug had fed in that big square, you get a bunch of damage on the anthers, okay? That's these little filaments here where the pollen are. If you look at the petals, there's like little warty spots on the petals. That's a dirty bloom. Well, what does that matter? Well, if it's bad enough, potentially that damage can impact pollination. We've done a lot of tagging of blooms and we really don't see a lot of effect. But what it does tell you, as you're walking fields, if you're seeing dirty blooms, guess what? You've got plant bugs in that field. I'd rather you be using a sweep net or a drop cloth, measuring retention. Maybe you have a scout and you're just looking to how much picks to use, but if you see dirty blooms, you better get looking for plant bugs. All right? Also, bolls. Yeah.
Dirty bloom threshold in some states don't do that?
Well, they've tried. And I can give you a general number where people thought they were close, but it doesn't always add up because severity of the bloom, but about 15%. I think the value is just knowing that you have plant bugs embedded in that field when you see dirty blooms. That should trigger you to investigate a whole lot more.
You're also probably late.
Well, if you've got dirty blooms, you're probably at least 7 days late. Probably be more like 10 to 14 days late. Okay?
Is there any new research on like taking in square attention and some different sunglasses squares and weather shaded squares, weather shaded squares?
That's tough.
So know a lot
So the
of-
question is, can you tell a difference between a square damaged by a plant bug and a square damaged by stress? Natural shed from whatever reason. Not really. You can take a pocket knife and try to slice that square from the top to the bottom and open it up with a sharp knife. And if you see localized discoloration, where that plant bug actually went in there and was feeding, if it's localized on one spot, it's likely plant bugs. But if it's just shriveled completely uniform, it's probably natural. But that's not easily done.
We had a lot of, it was like early planted cotton, we couldn't get rid of plant bugs. But
Yep.
then end of May, 1st of June planted cotton, it was just, they were gone.
Well, that's a great observation. And one of the things I've been piecing together, talking with, there's Scott Brown's here, we talk a lot. April planted cotton, our earliest planted cotton, that's where we tend to have our most consistent plant bugs. You plant cotton on April 20th, you get the 10th, 11th node, 12th node, you better be watching those fields close for plant bugs. When we get into our later May planted cotton and June planted cotton, a lot of times we don't have as much of an issue. Is that because plant bugs concentrate on that early squaring cotton? It's the only game in town, and then we diffuse them out over a lot of acres as more and more acres square? That's a question we don't know the answer, but it makes sense. That's what we would try to prove or understand. But that's a good point. It does appear that our April earlier planted cotton is where we tend to see a more consistent problem.
But Ag Logic, is there anything left in it to help with the early?
If we just look at a 5-pound rate of Ag Logic, by the time we're squaring, we're played out. Yep. Yep. Great question. Because we see the same thing. I'm just glad to know other people are adding this up and thinking about things. All right, just to show this picture of bowls. We crack a lot of bowls for stink bugs, looking for stink bug feeding, right? We usually select a bowl about the diameter of a quarter because that's what stink bugs feed on. Plant bugs can feed on very tiny bowls. Basically, a bowl, once a bowl is about the size of a nickel, a plant bug's not going to touch it. But a 3-4 day old bowl, a plant bug can feed on it, all right? You'll have the same type of injury, little warts. It'll be jelly inside sometimes. It could.
Plant bug can get some big.
Clouded plant bug can maybe do a little more than a tarnished plant bug. But again, back to the natural shed prior to bloom. And this makes, I don't even want to say this as an entomologist, but it's rare we see natural shed prior to bloom. It takes some serious stress, extremely serious drought or cultivator to stress that plant and shed prior to bloom. But if you're having a problem with square shed, maybe we can't identify it by looking at the square, but we can look for the presence of plant bugs. If you've got square shed and plant bugs are present, there you go. 3rd, 4th, 5th week of bloom, square retention is just not going to be as good for us because we're going to start kicking those small squares. At some point, every year you walk into one of your fields and you say, oh gosh, look at the ground. It happens every year, and we think we're ruined. Clouded plant bug, good lead in. I want to make one comment. Whoa. Clouded plant bug, not as common as tarnished plant bug, but more damaging. And this is not in our control guide. We don't have a section in the control guide or the pest management handbook for clouded plant bug. Simple rule though, every clouded plant bug you see, count him 1.5 times. If you got 2 cloudeds, that's the same as 3 tarnished, and use our tarnished plant bug threshold. They're more damaging. They tend to feed on bowls a little more. Here's the adult, here's the immature. They're a pretty insect, but I don't like them. All right, nobody likes them. Now, we have very good thresholds. Most of the thresholds we recommend, we have a retention threshold. If we drop below 80%, we want to treat. Sweep nets, we have those listed. Prior to bloom, a sweep net is a great tool to collect adult tarnished plant bugs. Once we get into, third week squaring, it's about 15 per 100 plants when using a sweep net. After bloom, sweep nets are still a good tool, but a better tool after bloom is to use the drop cloth, and that's a lot of work, okay? But irregardless, one of the things I am is a plant puller upper. If I walk in a field, I'm pulling up plants. I pull up 8 or 10 plants every field I go in. And I'm not just looking at retention. We typically look at those small squares in the top of the plant. I'm looking at the entire plant, every first position. Because in my mind, we have a goal of where we need to be when a field enters bloom. We need to hold at least 80% of first positions as we enter bloom. And if you do that, you have maximum yield potential. We don't need 100% square retention to maximize yields, okay? So we have a goal. Use thresholds. If you have a problem, we need to address it. Here's just some data, and this is the first time in my career where we have had an economic yield response to treating plant bugs when I've done trials. First time ever. But what this did illustrate to me, number one, we always knew they could be a problem because I see it every year as I visit with growers and agents and other folks across Georgia. But this really gave me a lot of confidence that the thresholds work in the state of Georgia. And I don't want to get too detailed, but on June 30th, this was some cotton planted in mid-April. Back to the plant bugs are here in mid-April. We were going to put a stink bug trial in this field. And we were just about blooming. We may have been blooming right here. And we were just out there doing some things, and I was like, look at all these plant bugs. So we got a sweep net and ran a sweep net. We were 32 plant bugs in 100 sweeps. That's a 2x threshold. So instead of doing the stink bug trial, guess what I did the next day? Put in a plant bug trial, right? That's my job. So we were at about a 2x threshold. We treated this red line, and I had about 6 or 7 treatments. That's just the mean of all the treatments worked. We sprayed and actually dropped plant bugs down below threshold within 7 days. Where we didn't spray, we actually increased a little more, and this was tarnished and clouded. But the point to make here, we were 2 weeks. It was a 2-week window we were above threshold. When we picked this cotton, it was half a bale. A 2-week oversight was half a bale of cotton. Have a scout, okay? If you have a problem, let's deal with it. We had orthene, bidrin. We had some diamond, bifenthrin, and some. I did not have centric. Should have had centric.
So transform?
Should have had transform. It's going to be a stink bug trial. All my stink bug treatments are ready to roll.
What was the best economical?
They were all the same.
About money,
They were all the same. So in this, number one, I don't want to be spraying orthene on square and cotton. Can we make that clear? Bidrin's not labeled on square and cotton. Only once you hit bloom. And I'm going to talk about specifics here in a minute. All right, so Dr. Schmidt talked about predators. And one of my favorites are these big-eyed bugs. So we counted big-eyed bugs basically 7, 14, and 21 days after we sprayed these treatments. The top line's the untreated, the bottom line's where we treated. We reduced natural enemies by half. Okay? Not rocket science. But you got to understand when you make a decision to treat plant bugs, guess what? You're taking out some beneficials. That's just part of the cost of making that decision. Collateral damage. There you go. That's a good word. All right. So let's say you have a field. We're going to spray plant bugs. What are we going to do? That was your question. A couple things to think about. Number one, where are you with aphids?
Hey, starting to build probably.
Starting to build. All right, let's just say it's the 25th of June. What's fixing? They're building. Guess what happens if you kill all them beneficials that were eating all the sugary popcorn things? So when I think about it, a lot of times if we're treating plant bugs prior to the fungus coming in and taking out aphids, we need to think about putting something in there to suppress aphids. Centric's a good option. Transform's a good option. A lot of growers want to think about imidacloprid.
Hit and miss.
Very hit and miss on plant bugs. If you got a problem, imidacloprid is probably not where you want to be. If you're barely at a problem, yes, imidacloprid would work. But those are the products you're looking for on pre-bloom cotton. You're looking at something like Centric, Transform, and maybe worst case scenario, imidacloprid. Now, if we're in a terrible situation, orthene is really, really good. But now you're really, really going to mess up that system. You know, mites, you know, orthene. When I do mite trials, that's what I'm doing is spraying orthene. I've lost my phone. What time is it? There it is. Any other questions? Once we get into bloom, you know, that's a little different story. But a lot of times we're covering these plant bugs with stink bug sprays. You know, once we get into where we're making stink bug sprays, it's trying to get to about that third. We got to get from squaring to about that third week of bloom. But one of the things as I'm going around doing grower meetings, I'm really stressing, and you know, we don't want to be in a situation where we have growers thinking they need to make automatic sprays on plant bugs, because that collateral damage, as you described, is just too great. The collateral damage spraying in late June or early July is much different than the collateral damage spraying in August, unless we got whiteflies. Then we understand.
If we have a lot more cold weather, hopefully we will.
Yes.
Maybe they will not be as bad, especially early.
Well, time will tell. You know, why were they bad last year? A lot of people ask me that, and well, where are they coming from? I'm talking about plant bugs. Where are plant bugs coming from? They're coming from alternate hosts. Last year we had an abundant rainfall. These alternate hosts just kept feeding plant bugs. In most years in South Georgia, what do we have during late May and June? It gets dry as a bone, right? And what happens to all those alternate hosts on the ditches and edges of the fields? They dry up and die. You get one big push of plant bugs and it's over. Last year it was just continuous. Okay? Absolutely. Especially early in the year.
Do you think Centric's becoming less efficacious on aphids?
Yes.
That's my observation. It seems to get worse every year.
Yeah, our most effective products on aphids, if you choose to treat aphids, are going to be Transform and a cell. Imidacloprid is very hit or miss, and Centric's same class of chemistry, but it's still more active than imidacloprid.
We like that virus take them out.
Yeah. But again, squaring cotton, I mentioned this earlier, important time when these things are colonizing a cotton field. And we don't want to disrupt that. Why are beneficials important? Dr. Schmidt's talked to our agents the last couple of years. He's talked to y'all the last couple of years. Here's why. Corn earworms. We've been blessed for several years. We hadn't had a problem, but things have changed. I don't even want to go here. Here's aphids. Here's your mites. You know, they help us. They matter. They matter. Friday night, 25 degrees. Saturday night, 23 degrees. It's going to help us, okay? It's not going to get us out of the woodwork. We had a lot of whiteflies scattered across South Georgia, not just in our little historical areas, okay? We had populations widely distributed. I don't know why. But we're glad to have some cold temperatures. But if you're in an area where whiteflies are fairly common, do a little prior planning. You know, if you have a farm where you typically have more whiteflies in previous years, and why is that? It's probably location to a source of whiteflies. If you're near a source of whiteflies, consider planting those farms first. Just some little simple decisions early now. And I know you can't be bouncing 20 miles over here and 10 miles over here, but with just a little planning, we might could help manage risk. Your county agents have cotton production guides. We got a lot of text you can read on this, but I really think we need to be giving it some thought.
How many hours, is it below 27 kill the white flies?
22.
22, okay. Not just one day, it's consecutive.
It's consecutive days. We're not going to kill white flies with temperatures, but what we do, we do two things. Last Monday was our first frost. It got down to 30 here. That was the first day we've been below 32, which I was surprised. And 30 degrees is pretty close to what I call a good killing frost. But if we get to 25, that's a dang sure killing frost. And what that does is we may have some weeds that were still hanging on that are infested with white flies. We may not kill the white flies, but if we kill that weed that's got white flies, immature white flies on it, we effectively kill those white flies. And then it's just a matter of heat. You know, we think of cotton, DD60s for how cotton grows. Well, we can do the same thing for white flies. It's a DD51. That's what it takes. That's how we can calculate how long a generation. So it's not just, we need a killing frost, but we need cool temperatures to slow this down in the wintertime. Because right now, I can assure you, in a lot of our brassica plants, there are white flies, okay? And they're going to be there. We're not going to kill them all with these temperatures.
I talked to Tim yesterday, planter, and he says that if he hits hunt, he can find a white fly nymph, pupa or adult in every brassica field he goes into.
Yep.
He says also that it's not as bad right now as it was in the winter of 16, 17.
Yeah.
But it's not far from it.
It's got our attention. And one of the things we do, you know, I'd encourage you to stay in tune with your county agent. We monitor little yellow cards for white flies within about a 30-mile radius of Tifton. We used to go a lot larger radius, but it just cost too much money. It's too many miles to travel, took too much time. But we're monitoring those populations. And I'll echo what Scott mentioned about what Tim Flanders observed, but the first week of July, it didn't look good for us. I mean, first week of January, when we got back from Christmas, we were catching a lot of white flies. But now those numbers have gone down greatly since then. But we'll continue to monitor those traps, and we will definitely, and people put me on the spot, wanting, well, what's it going to be? On April 1st, we'll put something out to our county agents. And I got a colleague in Tennessee, he says only an idiot would predict insects. And that's how he'd start off a newsletter, and he says, well, here I go. So on April 1st, we'll try to give you some kind of idea about what kind of risk we're dealing with, because that's about as late as you can go and still adjust planting patterns and what like that.
Have y'all seen enough effectiveness, like where you're going to have white flies taking biting out of your stink bug plant and using aphid or
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I know a lot of people just want to use biping because I'm afraid biping won't work.
Bidrin's a great product on stink bugs, period.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
And bifenthrin is not as active, especially on the brown species. But then it comes a balancing act. It's a give and take. You got to think about the other cost associated with selection of insecticide. You know, in the absence of white flies, you know, you got to think about corn earworms a little bit, especially on 2-gene BT cotton, about them potentially slipping through. But that must have made its time. Last call. All right, any other questions for myself or Dr. Schmidt? I think we're about 1 minute.
Are you still comfortable with orthene on thrips? Now,
Are we still comfortable with orthene?
Problem.
We're still comfortable with orthene on thrips. Great questions.
Not everybody uses ag logic, you know.
There are some states where they're seeing reduced efficacy on thrips on that 1-leaf or early season thrip spray. We're not observing that in Georgia. Our standard recommendation has been 3 ounces of orthene, pound to 5 acres. This past year, I looked at the 3-ounce rate and the 6-ounce rate, basically the same. So 3 ounces is still working. very economical. You know, it's not much money there, but why spend more than you need to? But 3 ounces still works. You know, I've used to talk about this a lot, but you got to make that decision if you're going to treat thrips. Don't make it too late. Other questions? I'll be around. Dr. Schmidt's going to be around for most of the day. Again, let's think this big picture. I want conservation of beneficial insects to be on your mind all year when you're making decisions. And that's going to help us in the long run in a lot of ways. So